In this video, we're going to now look at the actual Edexcel exemplar and see how this works and why I believe it has a number of issues that should not be given to students. And you'll hear later why I believe that, in my opinion, the student exemplar, the 100% marker, is much more appropriate to give to students than this Edexcel example. So why do I say that? Well, one of the first things that the exam board wants, and rightly so, is that any global variables should be placed together at the start and declared there. However, the problem with this particular code is that it's all global in scope. They've not used any functions whatsoever, and therefore the only reason these are global is because the whole program is global. I don't think it's appropriate to put all of these here when they refer to different parts of the program. And in terms of commenting, I think that this is get user login name. Well, this in itself explains what is happening here, and we'll come back to this part in a bit. So is that really that important? Or enter your 4-digit password, your 4-digit passcode even. I think that this code here is just overkill. The actual code itself is self-commenting, but given that this is what I would call the input process, I would put a comment here is that this is the input get user login details. And again, this is overkill for an exam, but effectively we would put end of get user login. So here we have the get user login details, we have end of. I'm just going to not bother with an end of, but what I will do is I'll then say that our next section here is what I call the process. And this is validate the user login details. And what I'll then do is we'll have the final section, which again they don't have because they've mixed it all together, and we're going to come back to that. That's the outputs display relevance message. And so given that these two variables here relate to getting the user details, then they really in this particular case belong here. Why on earth you would want to comment string an integer, particularly in an exam, just seems to me this to be completely OTOs, irrelevant. But more importantly, in this particular example, we're declaring them here and here, so we don't need to initialize them here. That's just simply a waste of everybody's time. So notwithstanding that they have chosen this method, this seems to be okay. But before we move on, I really want to again say that variable names should describe the input or the value that they are describing. And given that the variables here are login name and passcode, it seems strange that the examiner has chosen to use in ID and in pass. I'm assuming that they mean input, but from my point of view, if I see an in ID, then I'd be expecting an out ID. So at the very least, at least put something like input ID, but why not just call it login name and passcode? That makes much more sense, and ultimately it describes exactly the data in which we are trying to hold. So just so that this continues to work, I'm going to change that to the passcode. I'm going to update those here, and then in ID is the login name here. And to me, these seem much more appropriate than the in ID. Now, of course, we're now got invalidating the user login details, and these belong much closer to that particular part of the code, or this decomposed part of the code. Now, found seems to be a reasonably self-commenting name, but pasts, well, we shouldn't need to put a comment here if the variable name is self-commenting. And passed in itself is an ambiguous name. Does it mean that it's passed the test, or does it mean it's passed over? And if you think about the again, the mark scheme, it asks the question whether it's passed over. So surely, if you're looking at this and you're setting this as a exam board exemplar, we could at least say passed over. And the question is whether we haven't gone past the record. Where what should be, where it should be, where the username should be. So I'm just going to change past to passed over, which is here. I think that's the only place where that is changed. So these are just small changes, but they are, to me, make this much more self-commenting. This is comment overkill in my opinion, and certainly unfair of a teacher or an exam board to request that level of commenting in an exam. There's certainly some good comments here which tend to make sense, and I think that these are all useful comments except for this one, and I'll come back down to that in a moment. So this code here, I've added this code here, and you'll see why in a moment. But here, what we're doing is we're saying if the part of the record index 3, which is the login name, is equal to login name, and the part that's equal to the passcode, then we set found to be true. So once found is to be true, given that these are all and, this will make this whole thing false, and so we will come to the end of this part of the code. So if it's found, we set it to be true, we print this welcome message, and then if they both are not the same, then so it will do this check, it will check that, it will check that, and then if they're not the same, it will then come to here and say, if we're now greater than the login name, then we can say that we're passed is true, but we don't set found to be true. And in this case, here we go, passed should be passed over. So in this case, that becomes, or this particular part becomes false, which means again, with an and, any false input means the whole input becomes false. So we stop going through the while loop. And if none of those two are true, we increment the index. Of course, if we finally get to the end where index is no longer greater than that, then the loop will also become, or the loop will therefore end. If we're not found, then we'll print invalid login credentials, and that is what is required in the specification or the test or the question even, and this is required. This one is not required at all, and in fact, as we'll see in a moment, it's not good. Firstly, it doesn't actually say that you have to say and enter a 4-digit passcode, and I think that just enter your passcode would be a much better method, and I'll explain to you why that is later. The other thing here is that it says type X to exit, which seems to me that they're trying to add some additional functionality, but of course there is nothing to check to see if X has been entered. And so why on earth are they doing that? It just seems to me to confuse, and we don't need to be confusing our students. So now let's have a look at the at this code running. And I happen to know that GRE 107 is a valid username. But also we'll notice that they didn't add any spaces here, and students tend to want to do that. And of course space GRE 107 is not the same as GRE 107. I happen to know it's 3054 and it says welcome Madame Gray. So that works. Brilliant, it's passed the test. So now let's try and do one that doesn't exist. ZAE 123444, and it says your passcode must be 4 digits long. Well, there's nothing in the question that says that should be an output. Maybe you think that's okay. One of the things that I don't like about that is that it's insisting that it's 4 digits long, which is telling a potential hacker that it's limited to 10,000 different options, which makes it a lot easier and quicker to hack. But it actually gets worse than that, because if we run this code again, and I put GRE 107, which is a valid, apologies, GRE 107, and I put 0123, that is a 4-digit passcode. However, it says the passcode must be 4 digits long. So this is not functional because it is 4 digits long, yet it's giving me an error that says it must be 4 digits long. And more importantly, it's now told a hacker that it's not just 4 digits, it's 4 digits that presumably are greater than 999 or from 1000 upwards, which means that they only now have to use 9,000 different options. And why not start from 1,000 in terms of our brute force attack? So this code not only has extra outputs than the question requires, it doesn't actually work properly. And then the other thing that I'd like to state is that, again, it's about input, process, and outputs. Now, because we're setting global variables here, we can simply take this and move that to the end here and say, if found, we want to do that, else we want to do this. Now again, in terms of good comments, this is a bad statement, because it says if not found or passed. Well, this doesn't check for found or passed, it simply checks for if not found. So I don't like this comment at all. But we don't even need that anymore because we know it must be false here. So I'll just move that like that. So what that allows us to do is now we have our input, process, output. Of course, this will also give me an error, because it will also tell me now passcode is wrong, and then because found will be false, it will also tell me invalid login credentials. So I'm just going to get rid of this message, which basically tells us information we don't need, and if it's not in that, then it's going to have invalid login credentials, which is what the test actually requires you to do. And of course that's part of the output section, so I'm going to just move that to here. But we also have one other problem, and before I move on to that though, I am going to look at the student version so that we can understand exactly what happened and why that has given its thing.